The crackling radio transmission cut through the suffocating silence of the underground bunker like a knife through flesh. Commander Zephyr Blackthorn pressed her ear closer to the ancient device, her calloused fingers trembling as she adjusted the frequency. Static filled the air, punctuated by a voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of hell itself, broken, desperate, and fading fast. This is Outpost 7. We can't hold them much longer. They're everywhere. Oh God, they're everywhere. The voice dissolved into screams, then silence. Zephyr's steel-gray eyes met those of her second-in-command, Lieutenant Kai Emberstone, who stood frozen beside a map covered in red X's marking fallen settlements. Each mark represented hundreds, sometimes thousands of lives lost to the relentless advance of the undead plague that had swept across the globe like wildfire. The world above had become a nightmare of gnashing teeth and rotting flesh, where the living were vastly outnumbered by those who refused to stay dead. How many does that make? Kai asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 17 outposts in the last week, Zephyr replied, her jaw clenched tight. She turned to face the assembled survivors who had gathered in their makeshift command center. 37 souls who represented humanity's last organized resistance. Among them stood Dr. Lyra Nightwhisper, a brilliant virologist whose haunted eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent searching for a cure that seemed increasingly elusive. Beside her, Thane Ironheart, a former Special Forces operative whose scarred hands never strayed far from his weapons, scanned the crowd with the instincts of a predator. The bunker itself was a relic from a forgotten war, its concrete walls now serving as humanity's final fortress. Dim fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows across faces that had aged decades in mere months. Children huddled close to their parents, their innocence stolen by a world gone mad. Among them, young Arya Stormweaver clutched a tattered doll, her 9-year-old mind struggling to comprehend why the dead no longer stayed buried. The Horde is moving faster than we anticipated, Dr. Nightwhisper announced, stepping forward with a tablet displaying satellite imagery from their last functioning drone. The screen showed a writhing mass of bodies stretching across the landscape like a dark plague, moving with unified purpose toward their hidden sanctuary. At their current rate, they'll reach us within 72 hours. A collective shiver ran through the group. They had heard the reports from other settlements, how the zombies seemed to possess an unnatural intelligence, coordinating their attacks with military precision. These weren't the shambling corpses of horror movies, they were something far worse, something that retained enough cognitive function to strategize and adapt. Thane stepped forward, his weathered face grim. We've got enough ammunition for maybe 6 hours of sustained combat, and that's if we're conservative. The outer perimeter won't hold against numbers like that. He gestured toward the surveillance monitors showing their defensive positions, hastily constructed barriers and automated turrets that had cost them precious resources to build. Zephyr studied the faces around her, seeing fear mixed with determination. These people had survived when billions hadn't. They had watched civilization crumble, had lost friends and family to the endless hunger of the undead, yet they remained. They were humanity's last hope, and she carried the weight of that responsibility like a stone in her chest. There's something else, Dr. Nightwhisper continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The samples we've analyzed from recent encounters show accelerated mutation rates. The virus is evolving, adapting. Some of the newer specimens display enhanced strength, improved coordination and, she paused, swallowing hard, what appears to be problem-solving capabilities. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. If the zombies were truly evolving, becoming more intelligent and organized, then humanity's chances of survival had just plummeted from slim to virtually non-existent. Yet as Zephyr looked around the room, she saw something that the undead, for all their newfound intelligence, could never possess: hope. It flickered in the eyes of her people like candle flames in a hurricane, fragile but refusing to be extinguished. Outside, the wind howled through the abandoned city above them, carrying with it the distant moans of the approaching horde. Time was running out, and decisions that would determine the fate of the human race had to be made. In the next 72 hours, they would either find a way to push back against the darkness or join the countless millions who had already fallen to humanity's greatest nightmare. 3 levels below the main bunker, in a chamber that reeked of disinfectant and desperation, Dr. Lyra Nightwhisper hunched over her microscope with the intensity of someone racing against the apocalypse itself. The samples before her told a story that chilled her to the bone, a story of viral evolution that defied every principle of biology she had once held sacred. The zombie pathogen wasn't just spreading, it was learning, adapting with each new host it claimed. Her research station, cobbled together from salvaged equipment and powered by the bunker's failing generators, hummed with the urgency of her work. Petri dishes lined the metal shelves, each containing fragments of the nightmare that had consumed the world. The virus displayed characteristics that should have been impossible. Rapid mutation rates that typically took generations now occurred within hours, and most disturbing of all, what appeared to be directed evolution towards specific goals. Lyra. The voice belonged to Zephyr, who had descended into the laboratory's sterile hell to check on their only hope for a scientific solution. The commander's presence filled the cramped space, her military bearing a stark contrast to the chaotic array of scientific equipment. "I've been analyzing the progression patterns," Lyra said without looking up from her microscope. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had pushed far beyond human limitations. The original strain from Patient Zero was relatively simple. Basic motor function, primitive hunger drives, minimal coordination. But look at this. She gestured to a series of brain scans displayed on a cracked monitor. "These are from specimens we encountered last week. Neural pathway reconstruction, enhanced synaptic activity, even rudimentary memory formation." Zephyr leaned closer, studying the images with growing unease. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the dead are remembering how to think." Lyra finally looked up, her brown eyes bloodshot from countless sleepless nights. "The virus isn't just reanimating tissue, it's rebuilding cognitive function from the ground up. Each generation becomes more sophisticated than the last." Above them, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the bunker's corridors. Thane Ironheart burst into the laboratory, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "We've got movement on the perimeter sensors. The advanced scouts are 12 hours ahead of schedule." The weight of those words settled over them like a shroud. Their carefully calculated timeline had just collapsed, leaving them with barely enough time to implement whatever desperate plan they could devise. Zephyr's mind raced through their limited options, each one seemingly more hopeless than the last. "There's something else," Thane continued, his military training evident in how he delivered bad news with clinical precision. "The scouts aren't moving in typical search patterns. They're systematic, methodical. Like they know exactly where we are and they're just taking their time getting here." Dr. Nightwhisper's blood ran cold. "The pheromone masking compounds we've been using, if they've evolved past relying on scent alone." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Their primary method of concealment had just become worthless. In the bunker's main living area, families huddled together around meager meals, unaware that their world was about to shrink even further. Arya Stormweaver sat cross-legged on a thin mattress, carefully braiding her doll's yarn hair while her mother, Vera Stormweaver, watched with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone barely 30 years old. Vera had lost her husband in the initial outbreak, had watched him transform from the gentle man she loved into something that tried to tear her throat out. The only thing that kept her sane was protecting her daughter from the same fate. Near the bunker's communications array, Kai Ember's tone monitored radio frequencies with the dedication of someone who refused to accept that they might be truly alone. Static filled most channels, but occasionally he caught fragments of other voices, other survivors scattered across the wasteland who clung to life with the same desperate determination. Each transmission was a reminder that humanity's story hadn't ended yet, even if it seemed to be approaching its final chapter. "Commander," Kai called out, his voice tight with excitement and fear. "I'm picking up something on the emergency frequency. It's organized. Military protocols." Zephyr rushed to the radio station, pressing the headphones against her ears. Through the static came a voice that spoke with the crisp authority of someone who had never learned to surrender. "This is Colonel Magnus Stormforge, Northern Command. Any surviving units please respond. We have developed countermeasures against the infected. Repeat, we have working countermeasures." The words hit the bunker like an electric shock. Hope, that dangerous emotion they had all tried to suppress, flared to life in hearts that had grown accustomed to despair. But even as excitement rippled through the survivors, Zephyr felt a nagging doubt in the pit of her stomach. After months of silence, why would help arrive now, just as their situation became most desperate? Dr. Nightwhisper had returned to her samples, her scientific mind unable to rest even in the face of potential salvation. What she saw under the microscope made her hands tremble, viral structures that seemed to pulse with purpose, as if they were not just evolving randomly but following some predetermined blueprint. The implications were staggering, suggesting intelligence behind the plague that went far beyond simple biological adaptation. As the bunker buzzed with nervous energy and fragile hope, none of them noticed the subtle changes occurring in their defensive sensors. The approaching scouts had stopped their advance, no longer moving toward the bunker but instead forming a perimeter around it. They were not coming to attack. They were coming to wait, as if following orders that required patience rather than immediate violence. The voice of Colonel Magnus Stormforge crackled through their communication system with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural given the state of the world's infrastructure. Zephyr found herself gripping the radio handset so tightly her knuckles had turned white, afraid that if she loosened her grip even slightly, this lifeline might disappear like a mirage in the desert. Northern Command, this is Commander Blackthorn of Bunker 7. We have 37 survivors including civilians and children. What are these countermeasures you mentioned? Her voice maintained its military composure, but those who knew her best could detect the tremor of desperate hope beneath the surface. Commander Blackthorn, good to hear a familiar voice. The colonel's response came with the warmth of old acquaintance, though Zephyr couldn't place where she might have encountered him before. We've developed an airborne agent that temporarily disrupts the neural pathways the virus uses to coordinate the infected. Think of it as a jamming signal for the undead. We can create a safe corridor for extraction, but we need precise coordinates and a landing zone. The bunker erupted in whispered conversations as survivors processed this information. Children clung to their parents with renewed vigor, while adults exchanged glances that spoke of possibilities they had feared to consider. Dr. Night Whisper, however, remained focused on her microscope, her scientific skepticism warring with her desire for salvation. Thane positioned himself near the perimeter monitors, his soldiers' instincts on high alert. Something about the timing troubled him deeply. "Commander," he called out, his voice cutting through the excited chatter. "The scout formations outside, they've stopped advancing. They're just waiting." Zephyr moved to the surveillance station, studying the thermal signatures that dotted the landscape around their hidden fortress. The undead scouts stood motionless at regular intervals, forming what appeared to be a perfect containment grid. Their behavior defied everything they had observed about zombie patterns over the past months. "Colonel Stormforge," Zephyr spoke into the radio again, "we're showing unusual infected behavior in our area. They appear to be establishing a perimeter rather than attacking. Have you observed similar patterns?" A pause stretched across the static-filled channel, lasting just long enough to send ice through Zephyr's veins. When the colonel's voice returned, it carried a different tone, one that made her instinctively reach for her sidearm. "Commander, you need to understand that the situation has evolved beyond our original parameters. The infected have developed a form of collective intelligence that allows them to coordinate on a massive scale. We can offer you extraction, but it comes with conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Zephyr's question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. "The airborne agent I mentioned. It requires biological material from uninfected humans to synthesize. Specifically neural tissue. We can save most of your group, but we'll need volunteers to provide the necessary components for the compound." The words hit the assembled survivors like a physical blow. Dr. Night Whisper looked up from her microscope, her face pale with understanding. "He's talking about harvesting brain tissue from living subjects," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the bunker's ventilation system. Vera Stormweaver instinctively pulled her daughter closer, while Kai's hand moved to his weapon. The fragile hope that had bloomed moments earlier withered under the weight of this revelation. They were being offered survival at the cost of becoming the very monsters they fought against. Not zombies, but something potentially worse. People willing to sacrifice others for their own salvation. "Colonel," Zephyr's voice carried the steel of someone who had found her moral center in the depths of hell. "That's not an option. We don't trade lives here. Find another way." "I'm afraid there is no other way, Commander. The neural tissue must be fresh, extracted from subjects within 30 minutes of death. We've calculated that 2 volunteers would provide enough material to create a safe passage for the remaining 35 survivors. It's simple mathematics, 2 lives for 35. Thane moved closer to the radio station, his weathered face grim. "And what guarantee do we have that this agent actually works? How do we know you're not just another group of scavengers looking for easy targets?" The colonel's laugh held no warmth. "Because, Lieutenant Ironheart, we're the ones who created the virus in the first place." The confession struck the bunker like a thunderbolt. Everything they had endured, every life lost, every child orphaned, it had all been orchestrated by the very people now offering salvation. Dr. Night Whisper felt pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place in her mind. The virus's rapid evolution, its directed mutations, the way it seemed to follow predetermined patterns, it wasn't natural adaptation at all. "You're talking about a bioweapon," she said, her scientific training forcing her to voice the obvious conclusion even as her heart recoiled from the implications. "We're talking about the next phase of human evolution, the colonel corrected. The infected represent a new form of collective consciousness, one free from the chaos and inefficiency of individual decision-making. But the project requires fine-tuning, and that's where you come in. Outside the bunker, the zombie scouts began to move again, but not toward their hiding place. Instead, they formed a tighter perimeter, their movements synchronized with mathematical precision. It became clear that this wasn't a rescue mission at all. It was a field test, with the survivors serving as unwilling test subjects in an experiment that spanned the globe. Zephyr looked around at the faces of her people, seeing fear mixed with defiance. They had survived this long by refusing to compromise their humanity, and now they faced the ultimate test of that resolve. The colonel's offer hung in the air like poison, tempting them with life at the cost of their souls. Young Arya looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed far too old for her 9 years. "Mama," she whispered, "are the bad men going to make us like the monsters?" Vera's answer came not in words but in the fierce protective embrace she wrapped around her daughter, a gesture that spoke of a mother's willingness to face any horror rather than surrender her child to forces that viewed human beings as nothing more than raw materials for their twisted vision of the future. The silence that followed Colonel Stormforge's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. In the suffocating confines of the bunker, 37 souls grappled with the knowledge that their apocalypse had been manufactured, that their suffering served someone else's grand design. Dr. Lyra Nightwhisper stared at her viral samples with new understanding, seeing not random mutations but deliberate modifications, each change serving a purpose she was only beginning to comprehend. "You're lying," Kai Emberstone's voice cut through the static, his military training rejecting what his heart knew to be true. No government would unleash something like this on its own people. Colonel Stormforge's response carried the patience of someone explaining elementary concepts to a child. "Governments didn't authorize this, Lieutenant. This project transcends national boundaries, political ideologies, even species loyalty. We're talking about the next step in terrestrial evolution, a single, unified consciousness that can make decisions without the chaos of individual will." Zephyr felt her world tilt on its axis as implications cascaded through her mind. "The coordination we've observed, the strategic thinking, you're controlling them remotely." "Control is such a primitive concept," the colonel replied. "We're facilitating a transition. The infected maintain individual memories and skills, but their decision-making processes are now networked. Imagine humanity without war, without greed, without the inefficiencies that have brought us to the brink of extinction time and time again." In the bunker's medical bay, Dr. Nightwhisper's hands trembled as she examined brain scans from their encounters with evolved zombies. The neural pathway reconstructions she had attributed to viral adaptation now revealed themselves as surgical precision, bioengineering that transformed human consciousness into something alien yet disturbingly familiar. Her scientific mind reeled at the implications while her human heart broke for every person who had undergone this transformation unwillingly. "The volunteers we're requesting," the colonel continued, "their neural tissue would help us refine the process, make the transition more comfortable for the remaining population. Think of them as pioneers, ensuring that humanity's next phase is achieved with minimal suffering." Thane Ironheart spat on the concrete floor, his disgust evident. "You're talking about lobotomizing the entire human race and calling it evolution. I'm talking about eliminating the destructive impulses that have plagued our species since we first picked up tools and used them as weapons," Stormforge countered. "No more war, no more poverty, no more children dying because adults can't agree on how to share resources." Young Arya Stormweaver tugged at her mother's sleeve, her whispered question carrying the weight of innocence confronting evil. "Mama, why do the bad men want to hurt people's minds?" Vera knelt beside her daughter, struggling to find words that could explain the inexplicable. How could she tell a 9-year-old that some people believed freedom of thought was humanity's greatest flaw? That somewhere in a laboratory or bunker much like theirs, scientists had decided that individual consciousness was a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be cherished? Dr. Nightwhisper suddenly straightened at her workstation, her eyes wide with a realization that sent ice through her veins. "The mutation patterns," she whispered, then louder, "Commander, the viral evolution we've been tracking, it's not random adaptation. It's following predetermined upgrade paths like software updates." "Explain," Zephyr demanded, moving to the scientist's side. "Each generation of infected has shown specific improvements in coordination, problem-solving, and sensory processing. But they're not gradual changes, they're discrete jumps, as if someone is remotely updating their operating systems." Lyra's fingers flew across her tablet, pulling up data that painted a terrifying picture. "The virus isn't evolving, it's being updated, controlled from somewhere else. This revelation hit the assembled survivors like a physical blow. The zombies weren't just infected humans, they were networked entities, their actions coordinated by some central intelligence that could modify their behavior in real time. Every encounter, every narrow escape, every small victory they had achieved had been allowed to happen, studied, analyzed, and incorporated into whatever vast experiment they had unknowingly become part of. "You're beginning to understand," Colonel Stormforge's voice carried a note of approval that made Zephyr's skin crawl. "The infected you've encountered represent various test phases. Some retain more individual personality traits, others demonstrate enhanced physical capabilities, and a few show remarkable problem-solving abilities. We're refining the optimal balance for full implementation." Full implementation of what? Zephyr's question came out as a growl. "Global integration. The remaining uninfected populations represent control groups, allowing us to study the transition process from multiple angles. Your bunker, Commander Blackthorn, has provided particularly valuable data on human-resistant psychology and survival adaptations." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. They weren't survivors, they were lab rats, their every action monitored and recorded for the benefit of whatever twisted minds had orchestrated humanity's downfall. The radios they used, the supplies they had found, even their hidden bunker itself, all of it had been designed to facilitate observation and experimentation. Kai's voice shook with rage and betrayal. "How long? How long have you been watching us?" "Since the day you first established this facility 18 months ago. Your location was never hidden from us, Lieutenant. We've simply been allowing you to develop natural survival strategies while we refined our methods." Dr. Night Whisper looked up from her workstation, her scientific curiosity warring with her horror. "The samples I've been studying, you've been providing them, haven't you? Each specimen carefully selected to show me specific evolutionary developments. Your analysis has been quite helpful, Doctor. Your insights into viral behavior patterns have informed several recent modifications to the integration process." The bunker fell silent except for the hum of generators and the soft weeping of someone who had finally grasped the full scope of their situation. They had spent months fighting what they believed was a plague, only to discover they were unwilling participants in the systematic dismantling of human free will. Every plan they had made, every hope they had nurtured, every small victory they had celebrated, all of it had been orchestrated by forces that viewed them as nothing more than valuable test subjects in humanity's final experiment. Outside, the zombie perimeter tightened with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized by signals that turned individual minds into components of a vast, artificial consciousness that promised peace through the complete elimination of choice. The revelation of their true situation settled over the bunker like toxic fog, poisoning every breath with the knowledge that their suffering had been meticulously orchestrated. In the children's quarters, a space they had tried to keep untouched by the worst of their reality, young voices whispered questions that adults found impossible to answer. Arya Stormweaver sat with 3 other children: Finn Shadowmere, age 7, whose parents had died in the first week of the outbreak, 12-year-old Luna Nightcrest, whose older brother had been among their recent losses, and 6-year-old Orion Duskfall, who had stopped speaking entirely after witnessing his family's transformation. "Are we going to become like the monsters?" Finn asked, his small hands clutching a toy soldier missing one arm, a relic from the world that had existed before everything went wrong. Luna, wise beyond her years from too much exposure to adult conversations, spoke with the carefully measured tone of someone trying to be brave. "The adults won't let that happen. They'll find a way." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. She had heard enough through thin walls to understand that their situation had moved beyond desperate into something approaching hopeless. The grown-ups who had promised to protect them were themselves trapped in a web they were only beginning to comprehend. In the command center, Zephyr stared at tactical displays that now revealed themselves as elaborate deceptions. Every piece of intelligence they had gathered, every strategic decision they had made based on observed zombie behavior patterns, all of it had been carefully crafted to lead them to this moment. She thought of the countless hours spent planning defensive positions, allocating resources, making life-or-death decisions that had probably been meaningless from the very beginning. "Commander," Dr. Night Whisper approached with a data tablet that trembled in her hands. "I've been analyzing the integration process based on what the Colonel revealed. The neural modifications they're implementing, they don't just create a hive mind. They preserve individual memories and personalities, but filter them through a central decision-making matrix." "Meaning?" "The infected still remember who they were, what they loved, whom they've lost. They retain their human experiences but lose the ability to act on individual desires or make autonomous choices. It's not death, it's something worse. It's eternal imprisonment inside your own mind while something else uses your body. The implication struck Zephyr like a physical blow. The zombies they had been fighting weren't mindless monsters. They were people, still conscious and aware, trapped inside bodies they could no longer control. Every one they had been forced to kill had been someone's parent, child, spouse, or friend, still capable of love and pain but unable to express either. Thane Ironheart studied the perimeter monitors with the focused intensity of someone looking for any weakness in what appeared to be a perfect trap. "The scouts out there," he said quietly, "some of them might be people we've known. People we've already mourned." The thought hung in the air like poison. How many of their former allies, friends and family members now stood guard outside their bunker, conscious but powerless to help, forced to serve the very system that had stolen their free will? Colonel Stormforge's voice crackled through the radio again, patient as a teacher explaining a difficult concept. "I understand this is challenging to process, but consider the benefits of what we're offering. No more war, no more crime, no more mental illness. Imagine a world where every human being works in perfect harmony toward common goals. Imagine a world where no one can choose to love someone the system doesn't approve of," Vera Stormweaver countered, her maternal instincts flaring at the thought of her daughter's future. "Where no one can create art that challenges authority, or ask questions that make leaders uncomfortable. Art serves the collective good. Questions that benefit humanity are encouraged. Individual desires that conflict with species survival are redirected." Dr. Nightwhisper's scientific mind recoiled at the clinical language used to describe what amounted to the complete subjugation of human consciousness. "You're talking about turning people into biological machines. I'm talking about optimizing human potential. Your individual minds are chaotic, inefficient, prone to destructive impulses. The integration process preserves everything valuable about human consciousness while eliminating the flaws that have brought your species to the brink of self-destruction." In the children's area, Arya had begun drawing on a piece of salvaged paper with a broken crayon. Her artwork showed stick figures holding hands under a sun, but the figures all had the same blank expression. Empty circles for faces with no features to distinguish one from another. When her mother saw the drawing, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bunker's cold air. "Mama," Arya said without looking up from her drawing, "in my dreams, everyone looks the same. They're happy but they're all the same person wearing different bodies." The innocent words carried a weight that nearly broke Vera's heart. Even the children, in their innocence, could sense the true horror of what was being proposed. A world where individuality itself became extinct, where every human being became an interchangeable component in a vast biological machine designed for perfect efficiency. Kai monitored radio frequencies with increasing desperation, searching for any sign of genuine resistance movements or uncompromised military units. But channel after channel yielded only silence or the eerily coordinated transmissions of integrated populations reporting their successful transitions. The world beyond their bunker had already fallen. They were among the last holdouts in humanity's final chapter. "The children," Zephyr said suddenly, her voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. "They want the children specifically, don't they? Young minds are easier to integrate, more adaptable to the process." Colonel Stormforge's pause before answering confirmed her suspicions. "Children do adapt more readily to the integration process, yes. Their neural pathways are more flexible, less resistant to modification. But I assure you they retain all their precious memories and experiences. While losing the ability to form new ones independently," Dr. Nightwhisper added, her voice thick with disgust. "They form memories that serve the collective good rather than selfish individual desires." The conversation had moved beyond negotiation into something resembling a philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness itself. But for the 37 people trapped in their underground sanctuary, philosophy had collapsed into a simple question. Would they surrender their humanity for the promise of survival, or would they choose to remain human even if it meant facing extinction? Outside, the zombie perimeter continued its patient vigil, waiting for a decision that would determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. The weight of impossible choices settled over the bunker like a collapsing ceiling, pressing down on souls already stretched beyond their breaking point. Dr. Lyra Nightwhisper had retreated to her laboratory, but instead of studying viral samples, she found herself staring at brain scans that now represented something far more sinister than disease. They were blueprints for the systematic dismantling of human free will. Her hands shook as she traced the neural pathway modifications visible in the images. The precision was breathtaking in its horror. Whoever had designed this integration process possessed an understanding of consciousness that bordered on the supernatural. They hadn't simply created a plague, they had engineered a method for transforming the human mind into something fundamentally alien while preserving the cruel illusion that the person inside remained unchanged. Doctor, Zephyr's voice cut through her reverie. The commander stood in the laboratory doorway, her face bearing the weight of leadership in humanity's darkest hour. How long would we have? If we refused their offer completely, how long before they simply take what they want by force? Lyra consulted her analysis of the perimeter formation outside their bunker. Based on the coordination patterns I've observed, they could breach our defenses within 6 hours if they chose to. But they won't. Why not? Because forced integration produces inferior results. The neural modifications work best when the subject experiences minimal trauma during the transition. Voluntary submission creates cleaner pathways, more stable consciousness matrices. She paused, the clinical language feeling like poison on her tongue. They want us to choose this. It makes their process more efficient. In the bunker's main living area, families huddled together with the desperate intensity of people who knew their time together might be measured in hours rather than days. Vera Stormweaver held her daughter close while Arya continued working on her disturbing artwork, drawings that seemed to prophesy a world where individual identity had become extinct. I dreamed about the happy place again, Arya whispered to her mother. Everyone was smiling, but they all had the same smile. And when they talked, they all said the same words at the same time. Vera's heart broke a little more with each innocent revelation. Her daughter's dreams were becoming windows into the future that Colonel Stormforge envisioned. A world of perfect harmony achieved through the complete elimination of individual thought. The child's natural empathy and imagination allowed her to glimpse truths that adults struggled to accept. Thane Ironheart had positioned himself at the bunker's main entrance, his weapons cleaned and ready despite the futility of armed resistance against what awaited them outside. His soldier's mind understood that they faced a form of warfare for which no military training could have prepared them. This wasn't a battle for territory or resources, it was a fight for the very essence of what made them human. Contact on the perimeter, he called out, studying the surveillance monitors. But they're not attacking. They're doing something else. Zephyr joined him at the security station, watching as the zombie scouts began arranging themselves into geometric patterns around the bunker. The formations were too precise to be coincidental, too complex to serve any practical military purpose. It was as if they were creating some form of symbol or message using their own bodies as components. It's a demonstration, Dr. Night Whisper realized, studying the patterns from her scientific perspective. They're showing us the level of coordination they can achieve. Perfect synchronization across hundreds of individuals, each one moving in harmony with a plan none of them individually understand. The geometric patterns continue to evolve, transforming from simple circles into complex mathematical structures that seem to pulse with life. Watching the display felt hypnotic, almost beautiful, until the observers remembered that each point of light on their screens represented a human being who had lost the ability to choose their own actions. Colonel Stormforge's voice returned to their radio, speaking with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. I trust you're observing our demonstration outside. Beautiful, isn't it? Imagine if humanity could coordinate with that level of precision. No more miscommunication, no more conflicts arising from competing interests or misunderstood intentions. No more music that expresses individual pain, Kai countered, his voice filled with the rage of someone who understood what was being stolen. No more art that challenges accepted wisdom. No more love stories that don't serve the collective good. Art and love will be optimized for maximum benefit to human welfare, the colonel replied smoothly. Individual creativity that serves no constructive purpose will be redirected toward more beneficial outlets. Dr. Night Whisper felt her scientific curiosity warring with her human revulsion. Part of her wanted to understand the technical aspects of what had been achieved. The viral engineering, the neural modification techniques, the communication protocols that allowed the coordination of so many individual minds. But her humanity recoiled from knowledge that had been gained through the suffering of billions. The volunteers you're requesting, Zephyr said into the radio, what guarantees do we have that the remaining survivors would actually be evacuated? How do we know this isn't just another phase of your experiment? Because, Commander, the experiment is nearly complete. We've gathered sufficient data from the global test populations. The final phase involves demonstrating to the remaining holdout communities that resistance is futile, and that integration offers genuine benefits over extinction. The admission hung in the air like a death knell. They weren't the last survivors of humanity, They were the final test subjects in a global experiment that had already achieved its primary objectives. Their bunker, their resistance, their desperate hope for survival, all of it had been allowed to continue because it served someone else's research needs. Young Finn Shadowmere looked up from his broken toy soldier with eyes that held too much understanding for a 7-year-old. "Are we the last real people?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question struck the adults with devastating force because they couldn't answer it with certainty. How many other bunkers existed with survivors who believed themselves to be humanity's last hope? How many other groups were receiving similar offers at this very moment, facing the same impossible choice between voluntary surrender and forced assimilation? Dr. Nightwhisper returned to her microscope with new purpose, driven by a desperate hope that somewhere in the viral structure she might find a weakness, some flaw in the integration process that could be exploited. But the more she studied the samples, the more perfect the engineering appeared. The virus had been designed by minds that understood human biology better than humanity understood itself. "There has to be something," she muttered, adjusting the microscope's focus for the 100th time. "No biological system is perfect. There has to be a vulnerability, some way to disrupt the neural modifications." But even as she spoke the words, her scientific training told her the truth she didn't want to accept. The integration process had been tested on billions of subjects across every possible variation of human biology. If a weakness existed, it would have been discovered and corrected long ago. Outside the bunker, the geometric patterns formed by the zombie scouts had evolved into something resembling a vast mandala, beautiful and terrifying in its perfect symmetry. The display served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the level of coordination possible through integration, provided a hypnotic focal point that made resistance seem futile, and reminded the survivors that they were surrounded by people who had once been just like them. "Time is running short," Colonel Stormforge announced through the radio. "The extraction window closes in 4 hours. I need your decision, Commander Blackthorn. Will you provide the 2 volunteers necessary to ensure safe passage for the remaining 35 survivors, or will you choose extinction for all 37? The mathematical precision of the choice felt like a knife twisting in Zephyr's chest. 2 lives for 35. A calculation that reduced human existence to simple arithmetic. But she knew that even if they agreed, there was no guarantee the colonel would honor his promise. They might sacrifice 2 people only to discover that the entire group would be integrated regardless. "What about the children?" Vera called out, her maternal instincts overriding military protocol. "If we agree to your terms, what happens to them during the integration process?" "Children adapt remarkably well to the transition," the colonel replied with what might have been genuine warmth. "They retain their capacity for joy, their curiosity, their love for their parents. They simply learn to direct those emotions in ways that benefit the collective rather than pursuing selfish individual desires. They become perfect little robots who remember what it felt like to be human." Thane spat, his disgust evident. "They become perfectly happy components of a civilization that has transcended the chaos and violence that defined your species' history." In the children's area, Arya had finished another drawing, this one showing a group of people standing in neat rows, all facing the same direction, all with identical expressions of blank contentment. But in the corner of the paper, she had drawn a small figure running away from the group, its face scribbled with frantic crayon marks that suggested terror. "Who is that?" her mother asked, pointing to the running figure. "That's the part of me that wants to stay me," Arya replied with the devastating honesty that only children possessed. "But the happy people don't let anyone run away." The words hit Vera like a physical blow. Her daughter's innocent wisdom had grasped the fundamental horror of what they faced, the complete elimination of the possibility of dissent, resistance, or individual choice. In the colonel's perfect world, there would be no escape, no refuge, no place for those who chose to remain different. Dr. Nightwhisper suddenly straightened at her workstation, her eyes wide with a realization that sent adrenaline coursing through her system. "The neural pathway modifications," she said urgently, "they require constant maintenance signals to remain stable. The integration isn't permanent, it's actively maintained through some form of external transmission." Zephyr rushed to the scientist's side. "Are you saying the effect can be reversed?" "I'm saying it requires ongoing reinforcement. The virus creates the neural pathways but something else maintains them. If we could disrupt the maintenance signal..." She trailed off, her excitement fading as the implications became clear. "But the transmission source would have to be powerful enough to reach the entire global population simultaneously. We're talking about a system that operates on a planetary scale." The discovery offered a glimmer of hope wrapped in the revelation of how vast and sophisticated their enemy truly was. Somewhere on Earth, a transmission system powerful enough to control billions of minds operated continuously, maintaining the integration of every person who had undergone the process. But finding and destroying such a system would require resources and knowledge far beyond what their small group could possibly possess. 4 hours, Colonel Stormforge reminded them, his voice cutting through their desperate theorizing. The decision cannot be delayed indefinitely. Choose salvation for some or extinction for all. As the deadline approached, the weight of choice pressed down on 37 souls who had already sacrificed everything to remain human. In the next few hours, they would either find a way to preserve their humanity against impossible odds, or they would join the billions who had already surrendered their individual will to the promise of perfect collective harmony. The countdown to their ultimate decision seemed to accelerate with each passing minute, as if time itself had been weaponized against them. In the bunker's cramped quarters, desperate conversations unfolded in hushed tones, each person grappling with the weight of choices that would determine not just their own fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. Dr. Lyra Nightwhisper had become increasingly frantic in her analysis, driven by the slim hope that her discovery about the maintenance signals might offer some path to resistance. Her laboratory had transformed into a chaos of equipment pushed beyond its intended limits, jury-rigged connections sparking as she attempted to trace the source of the transmission that kept the integrated population under control. The signal strength suggests a source within 500 miles of our location, she announced to the assembled command staff. But it would need to be something massive, a facility with power generation capabilities that dwarf anything we've seen. Zephyr studied the data on Lyra's cracked monitor, her military mind automatically calculating the impossibility of mounting any kind of assault against such a target. Even if they could somehow escape their current predicament, they lacked the personnel, equipment and intelligence necessary to strike at the heart of the integration system. It doesn't matter, Thane said quietly, his weathered face grim with acceptance. Even if we knew exactly where it was, even if we could somehow reach it, they've had years to prepare for exactly this kind of resistance. We'd be walking into a trap designed by minds that can predict our every move. In the children's area, a conversation was taking place that would haunt the adults who overheard it. Young Arya Stormweaver had gathered the other children around her latest drawing, a picture of a door with light streaming through the cracks, and small figures approaching it with their hands stretched out. What if the happy place isn't so bad? She asked the other children, her 9-year-old wisdom wrestling with concepts that had broken adult minds. What if being the same as everyone else means no one gets hurt anymore? Luna Nightcrest, oldest among the children at 12, shook her head with determination that reminded observers of her mother. But then we wouldn't be us anymore. We'd just be copies of the same person wearing different faces. Maybe that's better than being scared all the time, Finn Shadowmere whispered, clutching his broken soldier. Maybe the monsters are right and being different just makes people fight. The innocent debate struck the listening adults with devastating force. The children were having the same philosophical discussion that had occupied humanity's greatest minds for millennia, the question of whether individual consciousness was worth preserving if it came at the cost of conflict and suffering. But these children faced the possibility of actually having to live with the consequences of their conclusions. Colonel Stormforge's voice returned to the radio with the measured patience of someone who understood the psychological pressure his deadline was creating. 2 hours remaining, Commander. I should mention that we've been monitoring your internal communications. Dr. Nightwhisper's discovery about the maintenance signals is quite astute, though ultimately irrelevant to your current situation. The casual revelation that their private conversations had been monitored sent ice through everyone's veins. Their last refuge of privacy had been violated, their most desperate hopes and fears analyzed and catalogued by minds that viewed them as specimens rather than people. You've been listening to everything, Zephyr stated, her voice flat with defeat. The integration process requires comprehensive psychological profiles to ensure optimal results. Your reactions to stress, your decision-making patterns under pressure, your capacity for self-sacrifice, all valuable data points that help us refine the transition protocol. Dr. Nightwhisper felt her scientific curiosity curdling into revulsion. They weren't just test subjects. They were unwilling participants in the development of more efficient methods for destroying human free will. Every moment of their suffering had been carefully observed and analyzed to make the process easier for future victims. The children's conversations have been particularly illuminating, the Colonel continued with what sounded like genuine appreciation. Their natural adaptability to the concept of collective consciousness suggests that younger populations will require minimal conditioning before integration. Your daughter's insights, especially Mrs. Stormweaver, Demonstrate remarkable intuitive understanding of the benefits we're offering. Vera's protective instincts flared like a wildfire. The thought that these monsters had been listening to her child's innocent attempts to make sense of their situation filled her with a rage that bordered on madness. "Stay away from my daughter," she snarled into the radio. "Your daughter will be treasured and protected in the new world, Mrs. Stormweaver. Her capacity for empathy and emotional intelligence will be preserved and channeled toward the collective good. She'll never again have to experience fear, loneliness, or the pain of watching loved ones suffer. She'll never again have the choice to love someone you don't approve of," Vera shot back. "She'll love everyone equally as part of the universal human family. Imagine a world where your child never experiences heartbreak, never faces rejection, never struggles with self-doubt or anxiety about her future." The promise was seductive in its horror, offering to solve humanity's greatest emotional challenges by simply eliminating the capacity for individual emotional experience. It was paradise achieved through the complete annihilation of personal agency, a perfect world populated by perfect slaves who remembered what it felt like to be free. Kyamber's tone had been monitoring radio frequencies with increasing desperation, hoping to find evidence that other resistance groups still existed somewhere in the world. But channel after channel yielded only the coordinated transmissions of integrated populations, their voices speaking in perfect unison as they reported successful agricultural outputs, infrastructure maintenance, and social harmony statistics. "There's no one else," he announced to the group, his voice hollow with defeat. "Every frequency I can reach, they're all integrated. We might actually be the last free humans on Earth." The weight of that possibility settled over them like a burial shroud. If they truly were humanity's final holdout, then their decision carried implications that transcended their own survival. They weren't just choosing their personal fate, they were choosing whether human consciousness would continue to exist in any recognizable form. Dr. Night Whisper looked up from her equipment with tears streaming down her face. "I can't find a weakness," she admitted, her scientific pride crumbling under the weight of failure. "The integration process is too sophisticated, too well designed. Every potential vulnerability has been anticipated and eliminated." "1 hour remaining," Colonel Stormforge announced, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I need 2 volunteers to provide neural tissue for the extraction compound, or I will authorize full-scale integration of your entire population. The choice is yours, but it must be made soon." In the suffocating silence that followed, 37 people faced the most fundamental question of human existence. Was it better to preserve some remnant of their group through compromise and sacrifice, or to maintain their principles even if it meant facing extinction? The decision would determine not just their immediate fate, but whether humanity's story would end with surrender or defiance. Outside the bunker, the zombie perimeter maintained its patient vigil, waiting for an answer that would either mark the end of human resistance or the beginning of humanity's final chapter. Part 8. The Last Light of Defiance. In the final hour before their deadline, the bunker had become a cathedral of whispered prayers and desperate embraces. Families held each other with the fierce intensity of people who understood that their time together might be measured in minutes rather than years. The weight of their impossible choice pressed down on 37 souls who had already given everything to remain human, and now faced the ultimate test of that commitment. Dr. Lyra Nightwhisper sat before her microscope one last time, studying viral samples that had revealed their secrets too late to matter. Her scientific mind had unraveled the mystery of humanity's downfall, but the knowledge felt like poison in her thoughts. She had dedicated her life to understanding the mechanisms of life, only to discover that life itself had become a weapon turned against consciousness. "Commander," she called out softly, her voice carrying the weight of final revelations. "I found something in the neural pathway modifications. It's not a weakness we can exploit, but it's important." Zephyr approached the laboratory station, seeing in Lyra's eyes the look of someone who had gazed too deeply into an abyss that had gazed back. "What is it?" "The integrated subjects. They don't just retain their memories and personalities. They retain their capacity for suffering. The consciousness remains intact, trapped inside a body they can no longer control, forced to watch themselves perform actions they never chose." Lyra's hands trembled as she spoke. "It's not death and it's not peace. It's eternal imprisonment with perfect awareness of what's been lost." The revelation struck Zephyr like a physical blow. Every zombie they had encountered, every integrated human walking in perfect coordination outside their bunker, all of them were screaming silently inside minds that had become prisons. The Colonel's promise of happiness and harmony was a lie wrapped in the cruelest truth imaginable. In the children's area, Arya Stormweaver had abandoned her drawings and was instead holding Orion Duskfall, the 6-year-old who had stopped speaking after his family's transformation. Something in his silence seemed to communicate truths that words couldn't express, and Arya found comfort in sharing that wordless understanding with someone who had witnessed horrors beyond description. "I don't want to forget how to choose," she whispered to him, her small voice carrying the weight of adult understanding. "Even if choosing hurts sometimes, I want to keep being able to choose." Orion nodded solemnly, his first voluntary communication in months, speaking volumes about the decision forming in young minds that had grasped truths adults struggled to accept. Vera Stormweaver watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, seeing in her child's wisdom the future that was about to be stolen from the world. Arya's capacity for empathy, her artistic imagination, her simple desire to remain herself, all of it would be preserved in the integration process, but forever locked away behind neural modifications that would prevent her from acting on any impulse that didn't serve the collective good. 30 minutes remaining, Colonel Stormforge announced, his voice cutting through the bunker's oppressive atmosphere. "I'm afraid time has become a critical factor. The extraction window is dependent on precise coordination with our global operations." Thane Ironheart had positioned himself at the bunker's main entrance, his weapons ready despite their futility. His soldier's training had taught him that sometimes the manner of defeat mattered more than victory itself. How humanity chose to face its end would become part of whatever story survived to remember their species. "Colonel," Zephyr spoke into the radio with the calm voice of someone who had found peace in an impossible situation. "We've made our decision." The bunker fell silent except for the hum of failing generators and the soft breathing of people who had stopped running from fate. Children clustered close to their parents, while adults faced the future with the quiet dignity of those who had chosen their principles over their survival. "I'm listening, Commander. We refuse your offer. All of us. We choose to remain human whatever the cost." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling the end of an age. No one had volunteered to sacrifice themselves for the other's survival, not because they lacked courage, but because they had collectively recognized that survival without humanity was no survival at all. They would face extinction as free people rather than accept preservation as conscious slaves. "That's unfortunate, Commander. You're choosing extinction for your entire group, including the children. I hope you understand the weight of that decision." "We understand it perfectly," Zephyr replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We're choosing to let humanity end as humanity rather than continue as something else wearing our faces." Dr. Nightwhisper looked up from her final analysis with a strange smile on her face. "Colonel, there's something you should know about your perfect system. The viral modifications create microscopic fractures in neural tissue that accumulate over time. Your integrated subjects have an operational lifespan of approximately 25 years before complete cognitive breakdown. You've created a civilization with a built-in expiration date." The silence that followed her revelation stretched for long seconds before the colonel's voice returned, carrying a note of something that might have been uncertainty. "That's an acceptable parameter. 25 years provides adequate time for technological solutions to extend operational longevity. Or it provides 25 years for your artificial paradise to collapse into madness as billions of minds deteriorate simultaneously," Lyra countered with the satisfaction of someone delivering a final scientific judgment. Outside the bunker, the zombie perimeter began to move with mechanical precision, their coordinated advance marking the beginning of humanity's final chapter. But inside their underground sanctuary, 37 people faced the approaching end with the quiet dignity of those who had chosen their fate rather than having it imposed upon them. Arya Stormweaver took her mother's hand and spoke with the clear voice of childhood wisdom. "Mama, even if we don't get to see tomorrow, at least we got to choose today." Vera squeezed her daughter's hand, finding in that small gesture the essence of everything they were fighting to preserve. The simple human capacity to love, to choose, to remain individuals even in the face of overwhelming pressure to surrender their uniqueness. As the sounds of the approaching horde grew louder, the last free humans on Earth gathered together in the center of their bunker, holding each other close as they prepared to face whatever came next. They had lost the war for Earth's future, but they had won something perhaps more important: the right to end their story as themselves, unbroken and uncompromised. In the final moments before the integration process claimed them, Dr. Nightwhisper activated a small transmitter she had built from salvaged components. A device that would broadcast their story, their choice, and the truth about the viral modifications into the void, hoping that somewhere in the vast universe, someone might hear and remember that once, on a small planet called Earth, a group of people had chosen freedom over safety, individuality over perfection, and humanity over survival. The transmission carried their voices into the cosmos, a testament to the species that had dared to dream of stars while learning to love their own beautiful, chaotic, irreplaceable imperfections. As the bunker's lights began to fail and the sound of synchronized footsteps echoed through their final sanctuary, 37 souls faced eternity with the knowledge that they had remained, to the very end, magnificently and defiantly human. Their story became a whisper in the darkness, a reminder that consciousness had once existed in a form that valued choice over certainty, love over efficiency, and the messy beauty of individual dreams over the sterile perfection of collective harmony. In choosing their own ending, they had written humanity's most important chapter, not the story of how the species had lived, but the story of how it had chosen to die.